Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Hotel Investors Marketplace webcast produced by Hotel Brokers International. I am Diana Hall, President of HBI and Associate Broker of Scoggin Blue, LLC, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, The Social Media Effect. While everyone is getting signed in and comfortable, we will highlight a selection of HBI member listings on the screen, and I will share a few items. Founded in 1959, Hotel Brokers International is a leading network of real estate brokers specializing exclusively in hotel real estate investment, providing every phase of the brokerage process from property valuation to closing. Visit HBI on the web at hbihotels.com. If at any time during the webcast you have a question, just click on the Ask a Question button located at the top of the webcast player. Type in your question and submit it. We'll answer as many as our time allows. We've also included some attachments and links under the Attachments button. The attachments will be available throughout today's webinar, as well as available later today when the recorded event is posted for an on-demand viewing at hbihotels.com. Let us know how we are doing. Rate today's webcast by clicking on the Rate This button located at the top of the webcast player. Please feel free to share this webcast by clicking the Share This button. Now I'd like to welcome our panel. Donna Quadri-Folletti, Director and Associate Professor, School of Hospitality Management at Penn State University, Born Hansen, Clinical Professor of the Tisch Center for Hospitality and Tourism at New York University, and my colleague Brant Niehaus, past President of HBI and President of Huff Niehaus and Associates. Donna and Born have produced a research study on U.S. hotels in social media, objectives, reporting, measurements, and results, a seminal effect to find out how hoteliers are using what have become mainstream communication avenues and sources of information. Donna Born, please tell us how this study came about and your findings. Welcome.
Thank you, Diana. I'm delighted to work with my former colleague, Bjorn Hansen, and I hope that we can give you some insight on what we found on this extensive survey that we conducted over a year's period. Let's get started. First of all, this was the first national study that looked at the 6 major social media platforms. You know them most typically as TripAdvisor and other review sites, Facebook and social networking, geosocial platforms, of course blogging, microblogging like Twitter, and rich media sharing sites such as YouTube, Instagram, and the like. This was the first time a property-level, hotel-level study looked at how hotels are managing these 6 different sites. And the study's purpose was to get at the key lodging operating metrics. We know ADR, occupancy, RevPAR, and the like, and how these are being managed through social media across all types of hotels and locations. So we were pretty pleased at an extensive response rate, over 600 hotels, and it represented a very good demographic of the types of lodging properties within the U.S. It was relatively equally distributed throughout locations, with little uniqueness with airports, of course, but also representative equally in the number of rooms, so the hotel inventory side. We did use the STR chain scales, which, as you know, are based on the chain's ADR, and independent hotels are not included in that. So on the last column, you'll notice that we also did identify the independent properties in the study versus the managed brand or just the franchise brand. So again, a good representative across the entire nation of the hotel inventory. So first and foremost, when we look at how at the property level social media is being managed, before we look at how it's measured, who is doing the job? So the function of managing social media primarily reports to the general manager, followed by the director of sales and marketing. And what we did find by that demographic is that there were some significant differences. Some of this may seem intuitive, but this is the first time that we actually know this to be statistically true. And that is, the larger the property, the more likely that the function would report to the director of sales and marketing. Urban properties and resort properties also, the DOSM. Now, it makes sense that in a smaller property or an independently owned property that the function might report to a GM simply because of the number of employees within the property. The social media function is interesting because it's relatively new. So how are we devoting human capital to it? For the most part, the frequency statistics show that there's at least one full-time employee or FTE, a full-time equivalent of an employee, that is doing this job across all the platforms. And you can see here that goes down to having other FTEs, 20% and 10%. What's interesting to us, though, is that who's really active across all six platforms, And in the location of hotels, airport properties seem to be active across all six. In addition, properties that are greater than 50 rooms in size, up to about 100 rooms, are also equally active. Now, if you have one full-time employee that is typically a managed full-service suburban 101 to 211 rooms we show here, mid-scale and urban. These are the most likely properties to have a dedicated employee to manage all of this at the property level. So we also wanted to find out, well, if the properties aren't managing this at the property level, then who is? So we asked if you're not active, meaning you do not participate at the property level, and if you outsource to a third party, or if you have a brand or corporate that primarily serves as your management arm for a particular platform. Well, again, perhaps intuitively, but review sites, microblogging, are managed primarily at the property level and are not outsourced. What's interesting is that geosocial and some other media sharing, such as YouTube and Pinterest, are not active across the entire sample. And that's interesting because geosocial, since it's a location-based social media, would be intuitive that you would think at the geographic location of the property that they may indeed be active. But that's not the case. The most frequent answer is we don't participate. So when we ask overall, what's the goal? At the property level, what makes sense? And we broke this down into quantitative with the green check and qualitative with the red bar. There seems to be a small problem there with the slide. We'll make sure that we get that fixed. What we found is guest satisfaction scores and indirect effects related to occupancy were the key measures that were quantitative in nature. In addition, in order to capture the loyalty and reward customer and engage them through social media, that was also measured ideally. The qualitative, the appearance of being current, tech-savvy, perhaps hip, to emotionally engage with the guest, these rounded out the general objectives of the social media activities. And so I apologize here that this, if on your screen like mine, it's not working, but I know on the attachment you will be able to see them.
Donna,
So I'm going to transfer over
slide?
to Bjorn. Pardon?
Donna, could you go back to that slide?
Correct.
If you go to previous slide, let me ask, just since we don't have the correct headings, it appears that all 5 of those areas are relatively equal. Is that what the percentage numbers actually show?
Well, in actuality, there is a sense across the entire sample that the soft, if you will, attributes or goals are more so their objective than is their, I'm going to look up, here we go. Trying to find my slide. There we go. That the soft, if you will, the emotional customer engagement, idea of getting referrals were more central to the objective than the actual quantification of occupancy increases or ADR.
Okay. I mean, that gives us somewhat of the relation. That's what I was looking for, is what was the predominant aspect of that slide.
Yeah, I think that in general, what you found is that folks were struggling. They know it's important, and they know that it is key to being present. But in order to deliver on the actual numbers, it was harder for them to understand. So increasing reservations, for instance, was important, and they are relatively the same, but it wasn't any statistical significance difference between increased reservation, for instance, and increased CEO rank. Enhanced positioning, although slightly less, hotel managers would rather be raising their review scores than generating additional or incremental revenue. So they are relatively within the quarter percentile, if you will. But again, the primary objective seemed to be to get the marketing message to be communication rather than distribution.
Okay, thank you.
Is that clear?
Yeah, that works. Yep.
Thank you for that, and I'm sorry about that. But it is important, and our goal was to look at those quantifying objectives, and I'm going to pass this over to Bjorn to talk a little bit more about the room nights and the other effects.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Donna. So the next screen it reports the results of asking, is there a direct measurement of room nights? And we really were asking the respondents to indicate, is it a formal measure as opposed to a guess? And I think it was a surprise to us that as many as 32% of properties have executives who are actually trying to monitor precise information about room night generation through social media activities. And the properties less likely to have these quantitative measures were smaller hotels in the economy price segment and franchised, so maybe with less management scale. The other categories of managed and larger had a higher propensity to be measuring. And one of the more interesting findings to us was that independents had about the highest participation of measurement. And intuitively, that might be because the independents are not supported by a traditional brand reservation system, so would look for other alternative platforms or methods of generating room night demand. Now, the next several screens take the data from those 32% that, in fact, are measuring or quantifying room night demand. So for those, again, who are measuring it, it was, again, to us, interesting that there was a variety of answers, but the second most frequent answer was that 20% or more of room nights are being generated or could be attributed to social media. And if we put together all of the categories, 42% of the properties measuring social media generation of room nights, finding 10% or more of their room nights. So again, 42% of the respondents are finding that 10% or more of the room nights are generated through social media. That's a very different finding than the estimates or intuitive findings from earlier research, which were 2 to 3 years before this research was completed. The next screen looks at average daily rate. There had been some inferences in reporting that the average daily rate for social media generated occupancy was much lower, that it maybe reflected last minute booking or millennial booking, more price sensitive, but that was not the finding in our research. This is in fact a major finding, that average daily rate is not statistically significantly different when generated through social media functions or platforms relative to all of the other platforms combined. And then even if the average daily rate is only the same, that's great news, because the acquisition cost would be lower through social media than through using OTAs. So again, we thought this was a significant finding from this research. Next is asking what the expectation is over the next 2 to 3 years. And about 44% of the respondents expect 6% or more increase in the room night generation, primarily through TripAdvisor and Facebook. Now, the 6% may sound like a large percent increase or small, but if we look at it on the base, it actually is large. The increases anticipated on those hotels that, again, are measuring and finding room night generation through social media, so the 6% growth would be on a large base. So this is, again, a significant finding that social media will continue to increase in its value of its contribution to occupancy.
I think
the next screen
Bjorn,
looks at the targeted. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brent.
I was going to say one of the things on that slide that sticks out to me is that 25% have greater than 10% or effect on their. I mean, it just seemed like there was a pretty significant number on the high side in that particular slide.
Right, and when we looked at the sub-demographics of that,
25% is greater than 10%.
Yeah,
I mean, that's quite a bit of hotel rooms that are increasing their reservations.
Absolutely, and that scale, we had more than 10% because there was a great variety of answers of more than 10%, but there were some respondents saying more than 50% increase in the room night generation. Now, when we go into the detail of that, those were typically respondents that had low bases to start from. So if they were seeing 1 to 3% of their room night generated through social media, but seeing a 25% increase, it was a change for that property in its approach and expectation, but the numbers may not have been as great as would seem by just looking at the 10%. Okay, that's a great question. The next thing we wanted to understand is the targeted generational segments. And Gen X, sometimes called millennials, is on the left end of the screen. The older age groups silent towards the right end, and then the far right bar means that there really wasn't a target. And again, what we thought was an interesting finding of this is it's not all about millennials or demographics, that it really targets all generational segments. And when we overlay from Smith Travel Research and other sources of demand data, the distribution is not inconsistent with the generational segments relative to their share of demand being generated in the country. So again, very different than research done 5 years earlier, which found that the target was for younger travelers. Again, the finding from this more current research is that it really applies to all generations. So again, very different change, reflecting maybe the expectation and the reality of the use of social media by all age groups. The next few questions asked about social media kind of expectations, and this dealt with is social media a guest expectation. 74% of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed. There really wasn't a discernible pattern by size or age. There were some more high-level answers for larger hotels and franchise hotels, and maybe slightly lower answers for urban, suburban, but the variation was small. The only thing we really found was lower levels. We might speculate, for example, in a case of urban hotels, maybe more stable generation of demand, more predictable demand in an urban market than, say, a resort location, and maybe smaller hotels having less resources. But again, the variation in a research statistical analysis like this between 64 and 84, although important, just shows it kind of is expected to be important for all types of hotels. The next screen asked a similar question, but about owner-investor expectations. And again, 68% of the respondents somewhat agreed or strongly agreed, and this result was just a little lower as an expectation than guest expectations. And the concentration of stronger agreement was with larger and more complex hotel kinds of operations and locations, which would reflect intuitively the nature of those owners, investors, and lenders. The next question we asked about was, is social media really a competitive advantage? And 81% of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed. That wasn't a surprise, but maybe the surprise would be if we kind of added up the numbers in the opposite direction. Those who strongly disagree or somewhat disagree, only 8% of the respondents. So it's hard to find too many hoteliers who believe that it is not a competitive advantage. And then for the next screen, we added local to the question. Is it important on a local level? And this was similar to the prior answer. Again, about 80% agreed, only about 10% disagreed. So again, 8-to-1 ratio of those believing that even on a local level, social media is important. Then we asked about the future, and will it grow in importance at the property level, again, the equivalent of the local level? And 80% of the respondents said social media is important in the previous screens, and 89% are saying it will become even more important. So let me repeat that so I say it better than I just did. 80% of respondents are saying social media is already important, but 89% are saying it will become even more important in the future. So we think we came up with some interesting results, and some of them were inconsistent, but maybe not expected based on the trends of social media. So we found, again, just to go over a few of the highlights. In general, smaller properties, more independent properties, franchise properties, social media reports to the general manager. But as hotels become larger and more sophisticated, there's a higher propensity for reporting to sales and marketing departments. About half of hotels have one full-time employee equivalent managing social media, but 20% have 2 and 10% have 3. The objectives are really to generate occupancy, achieve guest satisfaction, and for positioning and imaging. About 68% of hotels are not formally measuring occupancy, about 32% are, but for those who are measuring, almost 20% are finding, the second most frequent answer was 20% or more of occupancy is generated through social media, achieving a very similar average daily rate from all other distribution channels. And everyone is finding that social media is an important function and will become more important in the future. Donna, anything you would like to add?
Sure. I think that we were struggling sometimes to make sense of some of the dissonance in the results. And for example, when we asked, as the last slide that Bjorn had gone over, about how important it is at the local level, very important, obviously, across the sample. And yet, something like geosocial platforms like Foursquare hotels aren't as active on that as they would like to be. Obviously, management is still learning. It's the bandwidth to be involved on all 6 platforms seems to be a negotiation. They have to choose where their skill may be or their resources may be, so they can't be as active at the property level on everything. So there is still a learning curve, but clearly this has to be mastered for folks to achieve what they expect the future to hold, and that is more reservations and more will come through this particular channel. And unlike other distribution channels of the past, it doesn't seem to be a discount channel necessarily.
Donna, on these 6 different platforms, was there anything in the data that showed which platforms are used more for
Yes.
the hotel industry?
Yes, absolutely. TripAdvisor and Facebook, and or blogging or networking, traditional social networking, not blogging. And that was, we thought, interesting because content marketing is the buzzword today in terms of marketing, digital marketing, and yet blogs are really the center of that orbit of content marketing. And blogs weren't really something that at the property level, at the hotel level, that folks were as active on as they are on Facebook and TripAdvisor. Those are really, market leaders in their category. And, of course, they've also evolved. So there's the referral sites. There's a lot of things going on with those two powerhouses that across every hotel we saw, they can't afford not to be there. And they're still trying to figure out the other platforms.
I have a question. So this is a way, too, for independents to really increase their reservations at their hotel.
It's, again, cost-effective. Even those hotels with large numbers within the results of the study might have 3 full-time employee equivalents. Compare that to the commission rates on OTAs and what the cost of that would be. So, again, we had a higher ratio of independents actually measuring the results of room night generation than we did any other category of hotel. So obviously the independents are finding this to be worthy of the social media investment.
And although we did not do correlations across all of the questions that we asked, what we did find interesting, especially I think Bjorn presented on the predictions for the future, the competitive intensity, I think everyone, it was like 90% that said that it will grow in competitive intensity. When we asked about owners and investors' expectations, when we even asked about guest expectations, it wasn't as strong a response as it was to this competitive advantage necessity. And therefore, when you think about that, independents may find themselves or feeling more competitively intense against the, services and the reach of a strong brand. So obviously they're looking at that as an opportunity to compete effectively.
With regards to the, going forward, does this social media, is it going to be, the onus is going to be on each hotel to do their own social media, or will it become something where franchisors will become more involved and help in that process? I mean, you may not know that. It's not from this data. I'm just sort of thinking outside the box here of where does this go?
Sure.
Who's going to actually be doing it?
It's a great question. I think that there's some early insights from our extensive study. And I think that I referenced content marketing. When we look at things that have longer lasting legs, such as blogs, such as some of the Instagrams or YouTube, particularly I want to say rich media because of the cost involved with preparing and creating quality content. I think that may merge to be seen at a brand level, particularly if you're wanting to develop a persona for a brand, communicate a narrative about that brand that is consistent across geographies or across management. I do think that may be an indicator, and I think that makes investment sense in terms of the capital resources that might be there, and also how content marketing can serve a greater appeal. I'll make an analogy that it might be similar to an 800 number of the past, where that content really serves everyone who's affiliated with that brand. I think there's some early, perhaps, indicators. Bjorn may have also another insight.
So I would say the answers to your question is yes and yes. That the brands, now our study was at the property level, but we did have remarks provided as well. We invited people to add comments to the survey results. And I think what we got from those comments, so we couldn't do statistical analysis on them, but is that the brands are trying to position their brands through social media, trying to generate demand through social media, but the same thing is happening at the property level. So I think the next few years will be continuation of growth, but not just at the property level, which is what our study focused on, but also with the brands. Marriott introduced last week a social media campaign related to its loyalty program, just as one of the most current examples. And then what I think will be the challenge that will follow, not for the next 2 years, but maybe starting in 2 years, is how to link the individual property social media activities with the greater emphasis and efforts of the brands, so that there's consistency and compatibility and some control, so that the brands feel like they're generating what they can for their brand image. At the same time, the individual properties are trying to generate occupancy at favorable average rates with low acquisition costs.
And since Bjorn and I are both in education, I'll add simply that an early indicator, it may be that I remember brands having revenue management universities and deep training programs on systems and so forth, and that forthcoming, and there are some early signs of this happening already, that they will be offering their franchisees training in this area, so that the alignment that Bjorn and just outlined really does become a reality and is indicative at the property level.
Yeah, especially for the smaller ones, do you think? Properties?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to be across brand persona. So if you look at select or focus service, how do you help your partners, your franchisees, your owners to leverage what you're developing on a national level in social media? And I think that that's going to be the next, big wave of training.
I'm about to vociferously agree with Donna, but maybe just add a different direction to it, and that is for larger urban hotels, whether it's a managed brand or a franchise brand, the larger urban hotels may have a greater importance from the brand perspective to have consistent social media programs with those of the brand, whereas the smaller, maybe lower price point chain scale segments may not have the same level of brand support and need more support at the property level. So I think the answer really is again, both at the high end and the low end, and whether it's managed or franchised, the direction or the objective may be a little bit different, but the outcome might be very similar.
Okay.
Do you think social media, it's grown considerably. In some places, I know it's probably been 8 years ago that I went to a state hotel association meeting, and everybody was very high on Foursquare. That maybe has been successful in some other areas and some other industries. I don't believe it's applied to the hotel business. Yet social media as a whole, with TripAdvisor, Facebook, it's just grown and grown. And there are more and more reservations being made online through these third parties. Do you foresee the social media increasing that reservation process? That it'll become more normal for people to use the social media to make reservations? And
I'm going to say it's been difficult to now for them to see the kind of volume. If you look at online reservations, whether they are from brand.com or from any one of the OTAs, there's such huge amounts of capital that is put into those distribution channels. Social media that is integrated within those platforms serves those legacy systems at this point much better. It's been difficult, but yet it is there. There are Twitter reservations happening and so forth, but it hasn't had the explosive take as, you know, any .com site had in the past. And it's a great question, and if we had a crystal ball, we'd all know. It's difficult, I think, for hoteliers, as you can see, to understand and measure it right now. So until the measurement, and I think Bjorn made a very good point in saying that's the next wave of management tasks, I think until that's done, it can't really explode. But Bjorn, what's your thought?
So we did a survey of our students, and it was a small sampling because it was done during the summer, and it was students who were volunteers at our NYU Hospitality Industry Investment Conference. And just, you know, two of the most interesting answers to me was, you know, which, other than Facebook, which is used for, you know, general communication and updates, but if we had to put aside Facebook for a moment, you know, what social media platform is most important to you? And the answer was Instagram. And when we asked about the application for hotels, it was, and I think I'll use the exact wording as I recall it, I wanted to send a cool picture of myself at a really neat hotel. And then we asked what two hotel brand media were followed through social media. I think our expectation was it would be some boutique or lifestyle brand or some entertainment-related brand, but the two brands followed most on Twitter. Again, this is college students and recent alumni, Four Seasons and Ritz-Carlton.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is. Well, I guess you could look at it right now it looks like the larger hotels are employing people to do this, correct? It's the smaller ones that are not, that the franchises will probably have to go in and train, which could be somebody that's already there like the general manager, or it could be another employee.
Well, I'll add to that, maybe a bit of a clarification, and that is, I think that all of the hotels that represent our sample, and again, pretty large, across size, affiliation, and chain scale, have acknowledged the importance. So they're putting some resources towards it. And I do think that there's a lot of, you know, franchise hotels whose e-commerce and e-marketing departments are very, very savvy. I think what we were saying is that the training aspect will come from the alignment. That as, you know, we looked at 6 different platforms, and not everybody's embracing every platform as actively as others. And as the gentleman just pointed out, there's always a new media, right? There's always WhatsApp, Chat Up, you know, a Viber. You know, there's so many, you know, new entries in this category that I think that what is going to happen, or might be a projection, that it's about the alignment of messaging. So, and also how to maximize returns on those investments. But there are a lot of people who are engaged at it at the property level already. It's just how do you navigate, and maybe that's where the greater resources of national brands can bring to play, is how do you navigate what's the right platform with the right objective to the right audience and capturing share. So it's a very fluid environment when it comes to social media and any travel product. So I think that there's a lot more to come, and we feel this is a pretty interesting and strong base from which to contemplate what's next.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Please, at the top of your screen, it says questions if you want to ask a question.
Maybe we could ask a question of the audience, and that is, how many of them are actively involved in their property's social media efforts today? I don't know if we're equipped for polling.
I don't know, Brant, are we?
It may be difficult to get a number if somebody from the audience wants to comment on avenues they've used. It'd probably be easier for us to obtain that.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to hear if the brokerage community uses hotel social media, as part of putting together the book, and say, here's what TripAdvisor scores and comments have been about this property, or other social media kinds of inputs to position a property for a transaction.
I think you do see some that will make reference to TripAdvisor because it's probably the easiest one or the most accessible one, where this the property for sale may rank in the top 20% of its market, that kind of thing, to show that it's a respected property. With regards to actually using social media to sell assets, we just, in not just our experience, but even talking to some experts who really track the use of social media across all kind of industries, real estate just doesn't seem to be one in which the buyer is out there looking for assets on social media, because the seller's not out there promoting it on social media.
Right.
So it just doesn't seem to work. But using facts like you just described, Bjorn, of how does that property fit in the social media, I have seen that in a number of offering memorandums.
The number of Twitter followers and number of Instagram postings, and there might be ones beyond TripAdvisor that the members are using or might consider using.
It's probably something worth checking into a little more often than maybe we do as real estate brokers. But I have used personally. I've used TripAdvisor on a number of properties, especially when they're good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we want to thank Bjorn and Donna for joining us today. Diana, I'll let you close this out unless there's any other comments that Bjorn or Donna would like to make.
No, we're great. Thank you again for allowing us to share our research.
Yes, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
We appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Oh, there's a question now. Hold on.
So the question is, in other industries, brands have seized control of social media for brand consistency, and do we see the same thing for this industry? I think, again, that really wasn't within the scope of our research, so I'll offer an opinion maybe with some insight from the research, but not yet. I think the industry is dealing with, trying to limit distribution or acquisition costs, looking for alternatives to OTAs and other more expensive distribution channels, and the whole industry is looking for ways for social media and mobile and other alternatives to be realized. And right now, doing anything that might stifle or limit that, I think, is probably not likely in the near future. But I think when we get out a few years from now, the person who asked this question has a great insight. At some time, the brands will want to control brand image. But again, I think we're several years away from that.
I would agree, and I will add that the brands are going to have to justify to franchisors what, or to franchisees, what they as franchisors of a particular brand bring from a social media and what that effect will be. And since the whole industry is still trying to, I think, wrestle with the measurement, which was pretty clear in the slides that Bjorn had presented, I think that they have to make a really strong case of what value they add for that control. And when they figure that out, again, I'll agree with Bjorn that it'll be several years away. When they understand what that value proposition is, they can talk about it in terms that franchisees will understand, and then there won't be any sort of turf war with wrestling who owns it. We've seen that in food and beverage, by the way. We've seen in food manufacturing and in beverage manufacturing. Because of the persona that might be associated with that kind of product, and then also from the quality control aspect. And that's a really, again, thoughtful thing to think about for the future.
Okay, great. I guess that's the only question we have. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, don't forget to rate today's webcast by clicking on the Rate This button located at the top of the webcast player. You can download a PDF list of today's featured hotel listings, plus a selection of additional hotel investment assets listed by HBI broker members under the Attachments button at the top of the webcast player. Click on the Share This button to share today's webinar with your colleagues. And remember, this and previous Hotel Investor Marketplace webcasts are available for on-demand viewing at hbihotels.com. Before we go, I'd like to remind you of our industry calendar. HBI will exhibit at the Best Western International Conference being held in Phoenix on October 16th through 19th. We will also be exhibiting at the Vantage International Educational Conference and Trade Show being held in Las Vegas on December 5th through the 8th. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Brant?